our getMode function will return to us what number or numbers appear most in our array. These numbers will be returned to us in an array. So whether there is a single number that appears most often, or three different numbers that all appear most often at the same frequency, for example, they all appear 10 times, whether the mode is a single number or multiple numbers, we are going to return them in an array. To code out our getMode function, we will use a technique that is similar to what we did in our harmless ransom note algorithm, which is we will use an object as a hash table. We are going to define an object, then put every number in our array on that object as a property, and have each corresponding value be the number of times that number shows up. So if we pass this array into our getMode function, our hash table object should look like this, with 3 and 4 both appearing twice, so they are the mode. So the first step in our getMode function is to make this object. Let's get started. We will say variable mode object equals an empty object. This will be our hash table. Now we want to loop through every element in our array, so we will say array.forEach num. The first thing that we want to do is put our number as a property on our mode object, if it does not already exist as a property on there. So just like in our ransom note algorithm, we will say if this number does not exist on the mode object as a property, then set mode object at num equal to 0. Then on the line below, we want to increment the value of that property by 1. So we will say mode object at num plus plus. Great, that is all it takes to make our mode object correctly. Now we want to loop through every property or number on our mode object and find out which number or numbers appear most frequently. We will do this with a for loop. So we will say for variable num in mode object. Now we have access to every number property on our mode object. Now, as we loop through the properties on our object, we want to keep track of the max frequency that a number shows up, and we want to keep track of the modes. So we will do that above this for loop with two variables. One will be variable max frequency, which we will set equal to 0 initially. This variable will let us know how often the current mode shows up. So if we are halfway through our object and the number 5 appears 3 times, max will equal 3. If we are now 75% of the way through our object and the number 7 has appeared 6 times, max will now be 6, and so on. Below max, we will define an array to put all of our modes in. So we will say variable mode equals an empty array. Now, inside of our for loop, as we loop through the number properties on our mode object, we want to check to see if the frequency of that number is greater than the max frequency. So we will say if mode object at the current number is greater than the max frequency, then inside of here, we want to totally overwrite the current modes array and replace it with an array that only has this single number in it, since this number shows up most frequently and is therefore now the new mode. So we will say modes equals an array with our current number in it. We also want to reset our max frequency to be the frequency of this current number. So we will say max frequency equals our mode object at the current number. Great, so now the only other situation that we have to deal with is, what if the current number has the same frequency as the max frequency? Well, in that case, we simply want to push the current number into the modes array. So we will say else if mode object at the number equals the max frequency, then we want to do modes.push in the current number. Great. That is the meat of our getMode function right there. Now, there's an edge case that we have to deal with. What if every number appears at the same frequency, or the same number of times? In that case, there would be no mode. So how do we handle for this situation? Well, very simply, we can say that if the number of modes in our mode array equals the number of keys on our mode object, then we know that all of the numbers appeared the same frequency, so there is no mode. Let's write that out. We will say if modes.length equals object.keys with our mode object passed in dot length, then modes equals an empty array. This object.keys.length part over here simply gives us the value of how many properties are on our mode object. And finally, after all of this, we just want to return our modes array. And that is it. That is our getMode function. And now our mean, median, mode algorithm as a whole is complete. Let's test out our algorithm to make sure that it works in the next lecture.